Thanks for coming. This is really an honor for me to interview Karen Cowan, who has had a remarkable life and a story to tell. This is about, in many ways, the story of what happened in the past 50 or 60 years with poliomyelitis. Most of the audience probably has not seen a case, an acute case of polio in their lifetime. Those of us who are old enough to have seen it understand what it can do. I thought before Karen and I started going back over her experiences in her life, I just framed the story a little bit in the context of the time and just remind you of some things that I think everybody either knows or should know. Poliomyelitis was a scourge for centuries, and for thousands of years it was known. It wasn't really decided to be a virus and found to be a virus until the beginning of the 20th century. And then over a period of time, people tried to understand how we could develop vaccines and to prevent it. But it took at least a half a century before that came to fruition. One of the key architects of that whole enterprise was Franklin Roosevelt, who had poliomyelitis and suffered from it, and Basil O'Connor, who was really the director of the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which was the name given for polio for many years, and the development of the March of Dimes, raising money for research. And so a lot of the research up until the middle of the 20th century and the advent of NIH really came through monies that was donated through the March of Dimes, and they were instrumental in getting some of the funding done for the vaccines that were implemented. The winner of the Nobel Prize in 1954 were these three gentlemen who at Harvard had found a way to grow the virus outside of nervous tissue. And that turned out to be they got it in 1954, but it was work they had done many years before. And that was important because now a vaccine could be developed. And over the period of 4 to 6 years after this discovery, Jonas Salk and Sabin and other people started to develop the vaccine. Joe Melnick, who was the head of microbiology and virology at Baylor for 30 years, was instrumental in this whole discovery of all the enteroviruses that cause polio and other similar syndromes. But he actually turned out to be important because he developed a thermostabilized form of the oral vaccine that was used in countries where they didn't have refrigeration. So it allowed the distribution of the oral polio vaccine in the 1960s and 70s. That became very important for reducing the spread of the virus. Jonas Salk is obviously an important person in this. Did the vaccine trials with the inactivated vaccine in the early 1950s, and I'll show you a curve of that. And he went on to do other things in terms of starting the Salk Institute in California, but he's best known for his work on the vaccine that developed polio. Albert Sabin also is important because he developed the oral polio vaccine, which wasn't really brought into use widespread until the 1960s. So from the 1950s up until the beginning of the 1960s, it was really the Salk vaccine that really was used in this country and other parts of the world. This is one curve looking at, and this becomes important to Karen's story, even though the inactivated vaccine was used in trials, it was in 1954 and 55 that they started. And as you can see, the rates of polio came down over a period of years, but there were still many cases all the way through the 1950s in the United States. It took 5 to 6 years for those rates to be reduced. And this is one just looking at what was the annual average number of cases in the United States from 51 to 55 versus 61 to 65. It dramatically reduced, and that was true in other countries as well. So the vaccine did have an effect, but we have to remember that in the 1950s, there were still many cases of polio, and it wasn't cleared for active cases of polio in the United States until the 1970s at that time, in terms of saying we were cleared of it. Uh-huh. And now, there are only a couple countries that still have active cases of polio, and trying to get rid of those cases altogether. And this just shows you what went on in terms of the 1960s, still having cases all the way through 1967 at a low level. So Karen's story really starts in the 1950s, right in the middle of all of this change. even though the majority of individuals who get infected with the virus really didn't have any trouble with it, 1 to 5% did and had all sorts of illnesses related to that, which Karen will talk about. And even to this day, I don't think we know exactly why or what it is that led to some people having an asymptomatic infection and other people's having much more difficulties. That remains an open question at this time. So, Karen.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you for coming. Remarkable story. Why don't we start at the beginning? You're a Houstonian?
I was born in Houston.
And family was here at the time?
Yes.
And what were you told, or what do you remember about that initial episode of illness?
Well, I do not remember anything from the onset. I was told that I developed flu-like symptoms. I was taken to the doctor and immediately rushed into isolation in the hospital, and where I had no contact with my parents. Again, I was about 18 months old. And
which hospital was it?
I don't know the initial hospital,
okay.
But once the febrile stage passed, I was treated at the old Jeff Davis Hospital, which was for quite a while a polio hospital.
That's correct. And then you convalesced where?
Well, I convalesced there at the Jeff Davis, and then for rehab I was transferred to a place called Wolf Home.
Which was a rehabilitation center?
Yes, and I was taught to walk again. Before I learned to walk, I was taught how to fall safely.
How to fall safely?
Yes. So,
I'd like to learn that now.
it is useful.
Yeah. And you stayed there 6 months?
Approximately, I think so.
And then returned home?
I returned home, continued having physical therapy 3 times a week for several years.
Do you remember much about the physical therapy aspects?
I really don't. I just have heard stories about how difficult it was because I had a younger brother, and he was born during this time period, and he was carried along to all the physical therapy sessions as an infant. So my mother had her hands full.
So at what age did the rehabilitation part of this appear to stop, as far as you remember?
I seem to have reached my maximum muscle recovery about the time I was 4.
Were you wearing braces at age 5?
I was wearing braces from about the time I was 2.
Okay.
I wore 2 long leg braces, and I used 2 crutches. And about the time I was 5, I recovered enough muscle use in my right leg that I was able to walk without it, and went many years just on the 1 brace and the 2 crutches.
You ended up going to private school first?
I was in private school my first through 3rd grade, just to assure my parents that I would make the transition comfortably.
And did you have any surgeries after that?
I had many surgeries.
What kind of things did they have to do?
At the beginning, the primary concern was to make sure my legs were the same length, because with the difference of length that is very common with this, can cause so many mechanical problems with the back and the joints and everything else. So my doctor, Paul Harrington, was very aware of problems that followed with scoliosis and other back problems, that this was his primary concern at first. And when I was 6, the first surgery, they went in and broke the bones in my leg, in one place in they did this surgery. They didn't do it, outpatient or anything. I heard somebody gasping. No, so I had a break above the knee and a break below the knee, just to stimulate the growth. Because without that leg, the left leg is totally flailed. There is absolutely no muscle capacity there at all. And without the muscle capacity, the blood flow and then the growth was going to be different. And so that was my first procedure, and there was a little problem with the anesthesia.
Yeah.
It took me about 3 days to wake up. So I thought it was wonderful because I didn't know how anxious my parents were, and the doctors were concerned about my recovery. I woke up, everybody was glad to see me, and they gave me all the ice cream I wanted. So,
And that was not atypical for individuals with polio getting anesthesia. They had a difficulty waking up. It was.
I carry a card in my wallet that says that if I need emergency surgery, that I use about half the amount of anesthesia, twice the amount of painkillers, and twice the amount of recovery time. So, which seems to be what they've figured out as the standard. My second operation was about probably 4 years later, where they did the same surgery again because it was very effective. And then about the time I reached puberty, they closed the growth centers in my good leg because I had reached the full amount of growth I was going to get in my left leg, and I wanted to make sure my legs were the same length. I gather, just looking at my family history, I might have had I'm pretty short, you could tell, but I might have had another 3 inches just looking at my family. I come from a long line of short people.
Well, how many operations did you have by the time you were 18?
Probably 7 or 8. There was 1 year where I had 3 in a calendar year. It was scheduled. None of them were surprises. But I had to have some vascular surgery done because the previous surgery I had, they had some blood flow problems during surgery and then again after surgery. So they did a sympathectomy to increase the blood flow to my left leg.
And you then went from private school into public school?
I went in 4th grade. I went into public school, and I was very fortunate. I really don't remember being the receiver of any kind of bullying or people making fun of me. I was very accepted. I couldn't compete on the playground, but it was a neighborhood school where competing in the classroom it seemed to be a value that was shared by most of the families in the neighborhood.
And this is in Houston?
This is in Houston.
And did you have to have the surgeries during the summer? Or?
I had a number of summers ruined.
Yeah.
Where I missed other activities. I did have one summer where I was sent to camp, sleepaway camp. I think it was a week. It was
A special camp? Or?
Yes, and it really was not a good match for me. It was the Lions Club at that time, and probably still does, sponsors a camp for crippled children. And right away, the terminology was just something that was very difficult for me to swallow. And I was much more able than the other campers. But regular camps would not they wouldn't accept me because at that time I really didn't require accommodation. I was very active on my brace and crutches. I needed no assistance. I was very independent. I had a bicycle, and I would ride it with one leg, so I was pretty much off balance. The other leg, I locked the brace so it would stick out like this, and I would just kind of have it off to the side. The other leg would be pedaling around. Needless to say, I never got rid of my training wheels. I was pretty off balance, but I got around with the other kids and kept up. I do remember when I was in elementary school, roller skating parties were very popular, and of course I had to sit on the side and watch everybody having fun and falling down. And after about the third party, I said, "This is ridiculous. I know I can do this." And I went and I got one skate, and I put it on, and I used my crutches to push myself around, and I was the steadiest person on the rink, you know. But the mother of the birthday girl called my mother, and the two of them freaked out, and I never did it again. So.
You have a few pictures. Do you want to show a couple of those now?
Okay.
Let's see whether there's Lollipop Mountain.
I did a little bit of publicity. This was a bank that had donated lollipops for the children who were going to get their vaccines. And so this appeared in one of the Houston papers, just advertising the vaccine availability, and that encourage people to get their children vaccinated. And then this is just a view, or a couple of views. You can see my equipment. And I think I was about 3 there, just kind of looking at my size. The older man was my dad, so. And you can see in this picture where I had the left leg locked, so that allowed me to put weight on that leg, because otherwise it would just collapse.
Who is the woman in the other picture?
I think she's the
mother
little
of-
boy's mother.
Okay.
So,
Well,
okay. This was my doctor, Paul Harrington. Can we go into that
Sure,
now?
yeah.
He really gets so much credit for many of the successes and the abilities I've been able to have during my life. He treated me, but he also treated my whole family. And in terms of it was more of a holistic sort of situation. I just have visions of, I remember sitting in his office and speaking with him for an hour. We'd go semi-annually, get a checkup, see where I was. And he was just very kind, spent a lot of time with my parents on raising me and to be independent. And he, excuse me, when I needed surgery, I remember vividly where he'd sit me on his knee and draw pictures of what he was going to do and what I should expect. And I always was well prepared before I went into every surgery, and I really didn't feel terribly afraid, because he worked very hard to make me comfortable, and I knew he was going to take good care of me. Sometime after the number of polio patients started dropping, he went into a different interest treating scoliosis patients. And it was one of the reasons I used crutches all my life, was even during the time where I really didn't need them, was to make sure that my back was strong and straight. But I continued with him, even though he was specializing in scoliosis patients. He kept a dozen or 2 dozen polio patients that he saw us through our lives until he died. And he did all of my surgeries. And the only problems I ever ran into is when I'd check into the hospital for my surgeries, and they'd want to prep me for those scoliosis operations. And they just didn't believe a 14-year-old knew what what the plans were. So,
Dr. Harrington, for those who don't know that name, was one of the leaders in the field of surgery related to scoliosis, and the famous Harrington rod is his development. He was a faculty member at Baylor and was at Jefferson Davis Methodist Hospital, a key person in the medical center's whole list of wonderful physicians, and your experience bears up the kind of person everybody spoke about in terms of his interaction with his patients. A real gentleman.
He really was.
A wonderful physician. So after that, you ended up going to public school.
I did.
And you go to high school.
Here in Houston.
And the high school was?
Bel Air High School.
The Bel Air High School.
The Bel Air High School.
Okay. For those of you who know the Bel Air High School. And what was that like, being in high school at that time? Were you using crutches then and walking around? Did you have a brace? How did the other students view you?
I was still using a left leg brace and my crutches. Carrying all my books around, my textbooks, was something of a challenge, and we ended up checking out a set of textbooks at home, and then I had a set of textbooks in the building, so that at least I wasn't carrying them back and forth. But I was still climbing to the third floor with my satchel of books. That was before students had backpacks, and so everybody just carried them in their arm, except me. And I felt like I was very accepted. I was very visible, and even to this day, my husband doesn't understand why I'm so surprised when people remember me. And he says, well, you look different than everybody else. But that just never has been part of my consciousness. And I think to some extent that affected the way people saw me. And I was active in the school. And
class officer?
I was a senior class officer. In junior high school, I was the president of the student council. So I was used to talking to people, in front of people. I carried a full academic load.
And then after graduating Bel Air, you went off to college?
I did.
At Washington University?
I graduated from Washington University.
And your major was?
Mathematics.
Tell us about why mathematics. There must be a reason.
Well, I enjoyed math. I enjoyed the beauty of it. I enjoyed the solving, and the logic just was very comfortable to me.
At that time, computers weren't very available, so you learned a different kind of math?
Well, I did. We did learn to do a little bit of coding, but my father was a bit of a pioneer in the computer history, and he'd been using computers since 1952. And we do have a story where a package came in the mail. I was still in elementary school, and I was able to determine from the packaging that it would be something interesting, and I opened it up, and it was, a bunch of plastic pieces and a few metal pieces, and I proceeded to put it together before my father ever got home, and he had ordered this computer that could do binary functions, manual. It didn't have a motor or anything like that, and he was rather disappointed that he didn't get to put it together. So
you graduated Wash U, and yes. What happened then?
I got married.
Got married, and where did you meet your husband?
Well, we had.
They all want to know this.
It'll be in the tabloids tomorrow. We knew each other in high school. And we started dating right after I graduated from high school.
Okay. And so,
So 3 years later, we got married.
and then he went to law school,
He did in Dallas.
and you followed him there.
I did. We were married.
Yes.
We liked being together.
And after law school, you came back
We
to
came
Houston?
back to Houston. We did.
Okay. And you had a position in Houston for some time with an oil company?
I did computer work, some financial modeling for a couple of mostly smaller oil companies. Also worked for a big oil company.
And had children?
We had 2 sons.
And they're now grown?
They are grown. One's married.
Tell us a little bit about how it was to be a parent of young kids with your situation, and what were some of the problems that you faced?
Well, first I'd like to mention just a bit about my pregnancies.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
I had normal pregnancies, and I did have to wear a corset to help to support the babies because I did have some abdominal muscle involvement. But we quickly found out that without a lot of muscle fighting, the uterus really is able to push babies out very quickly. And I had very short labors, very easy labors. I was lucky, healthy babies. So, but that nobody had told me to expect that, so it was quite a pleasant surprise. I had talked with my obstetrician about epidurals, and he said, well, given your paralysis, you probably need to go talk to the anesthesiology group. So I went and I talked to the anesthesiology group, and we talked about, and we documented my paralysis because they were a little nervous working around my spinal cord. And we got it, they settled. They agreed there would be no problem. I could have an epidural if I wanted one. And it turned out on the early morning of July 3rd, the anesthesiologist came by to meet me, and my doctor was out of town for the holiday weekend, and all of the anesthesiologists in the group that I had talked to were out of town, and this doctor did not want to touch me. And especially since my husband wrote down on my application, when I registered, that he had, his occupation was lawyer. And so we had some words and some raised voices on my part, and he finally agreed because he was pretty sure I wasn't going to need an epidural. So, and I didn't. And so just some of the little obstacles.
Any other obstacles once they're delivered, once you take them home?
Well, carrying them, and diaper bags and purses and 2 crutches were sometimes a lot to keep track of. I remember our first child was about 3 weeks old, and I went for my follow-up checkup, and I locked him in the car. So I was a very panicky new mother, but it worked out. People came and helped me, and we got him out before it was a problem. But because my use of the crutches was really not as much for support as for just taking care of my back, I could have been seen walking around with my crutches hiked up under my armpit so that I could use my arms to carry a baby. I had to train everybody who ever came in the house to help that you could not calm our children by walking and jiggling them like most people do, because I wasn't able to do that. And so nobody was allowed to do that, so the babies learned to calm themselves differently in a rocking chair or whatever.
Respond to the voice rather than...
Respond to the voice and the touch and that sort of thing, but nobody could walk with them. Once they were walking and running, we had to train them not to run from me when, as children tend to do as entertainment. They think it's funny to run away when someone's chasing them. The fear that they would run into a street, we really worked very hard on using a certain tone of voice of stop that they learned to respond to.
And that worked?
On the whole. But luckily, everybody was safe. So.
And are they in Houston now?
Our younger son is in Houston. Our older son and his wife live in St. Louis. They are starting to become very protective of me at this point in my life.
What do you think about that?
I
You
think
like that?
I do. It makes me proud of them, that they're mature human beings and they have empathy. And
so we didn't talk a lot about your mother and your father in terms of that. How did they influence all of your response to this illness?
Well, my dad had a serious hearing problems from birth and was amazing in his overcoming. And he was working on his PhD before he ever got a hearing aid. And so it was, he really was an amazing role model for me on how you deal with a disability. Both of them had the attitude and shared the attitude with me that it was my responsibility to be independent and to make things work. And my mother worked very, very hard. I remember or have heard stories of in between physical therapy sessions, she would walk me around the block training so that I'd have the right gait. So if any of you have physical therapy experience, there are different gaits that you use with crutches, and whether you swing through and or whether you use and so you use both feet together, or you use one foot first and then the crutches and the other foot follows, or you use one foot first and the other foot and then the crutches, and there were different gaits by different names, and I had to learn them all and be able to do them automatically. When you want to walk, you think, I'm going over there, and your body does that. And when I want to walk, I had to be taught to instantaneously go through the process of, okay, you have to do this, and then make my legs respond. And so it was hours and hours of training as a small child. So for most of my life, it seemed like I was able to do what you did because of all of that training. I was never allowed a pity party. That just didn't happen in our house. There was no saying, I can't do that. And this was very typical of people who had polio, because the recovery process required you to push your muscles and to do things that seemed impossible. And then when you got to the point where you just couldn't do any more, you still had to do more. And so, and especially since I was so young learning this, it was really ingrained to push and push, very much a type A personality. Anything was possible. You could even be President of the United States, even if you had had polio. And that was the standard. And I was held to that standard, as most polio survivors were. it was interesting when my mother died a few years ago. I got notes from some of the people I grew up with, and they said, your mother seemed so strict and so demanding. And now that I'm a parent, I understand so much and what she did for you.
And how has it been since she's gone now in terms of you interacting with your own children in that regard? Do you use some of the things she taught you in parenting?
Well, there are a lot of things I've tried not to do. and yet I think all of us who have said that slip back into those molds.
Yeah.
Those things you said, I will never say that to my children. You will. But hopefully we've set high standards in terms of achieving everything that they are capable of.
So in terms of your situation, in terms of your medical condition now, how are things changed, or have they changed, and when did you notice things not going as well as they had been?
About 30 to 35 years after onset, I was diagnosed with what they were calling then post-polio syndrome. I don't know what they call it now. Still that. I had been reading about it. It was occasionally in the paper, and it was, I think, once a year they did a segment on the local news. Basically, all of those muscles that we were pushing and pushing were suddenly failing and hurting, really hurting. And I had started with different doctors, and you go to your local internist or whatever, and they said, well, you have 2 small children at home. What do you expect? You're going to be tired. And I knew that was wrong. I became aware of TEAR.
Let me just, for those of you who don't know, this is Bill Spencer, William Spencer, who led TEAR for many years. Very important person in the history of medical center and Houston, and was instrumental in bringing, at that time, it was, before it was TEAR, it was the Southwest Polio Foundation here, and it really started out as rehabilitation for polio, and then over the 50s and 60s, it got converted into the Texas Institute for Rehabilitation and Research, and is internationally known for its work, including the post-polio syndrome. And then one of the many people here may have been part of that, but the post-polio syndrome, as you know, is worldwide. There are people worldwide who suffer from this, and it's estimated that 25 to 50% of people who have survived an acute attack will come down with this. Symptoms are just what you've described: muscle weakness, pain in the muscles, fatigue. Don't know why. Don't know. People have tried to sort out who's going to come down with it. There are all sorts of treatments that have been tried, but without much specific success. And one of the key people in Houston who's also been working on the post-polio syndrome before he passed away was Carlos Valbona, who ran the post-polio center at TIR, and I think he interacted with you for many years.
Yes, yes.
Tell us about your experiences then with TEAR and that particular aspect of the post-polio syndrome.
Well, I had been in and out of TEAR, not as an inpatient, but using their physical therapy departments, rehabbing after surgery. And so I was familiar with the setting. When I heard that they had started a post-polio clinic, I went over there, and the diagnosis of post-polio involved using and doing an EMG on muscles all over my body, which became the longer, the more muscles they did, it became excruciating. Yeah. It was so many. But they did, in fact, verify that I had polio, which we knew. And and that they're, so then they started treating the weakness and training me to conserve my energy. And that included everything from getting a scooter like this so that I could continue working, continue going to my children's baseball and soccer games. I also had to be more aware of what activities I spent energy on and what activities didn't come to the level of being that important. I had to change my attitudes. I could no longer push myself. There was no more type A personality. And that was a big change. That took, all of these things took a long time adjusting and making a change to my lifestyle and the way I did things, because I was always able to do whatever I wanted. And I could make my body do it. And now I could make my body do it, but I was going to pay a heavy price in pain and exhaustion. I continued working for a number of years, and then I went to part-time, and then I eventually took disability. And I just remember when I took the disability, I slept for about 6 weeks. Obviously not straight through, but 10, 12 hours a day. I was sleeping. I had worn myself out so much. It took me 6 weeks of sleeping to be able to resume some life activities. I remember about a year after I stopped working, I walked into my closet and I said, oh my God, everything in here is black. Everything I have bought and worn for a year is black. And, so I really wasn't in tune that whole time with how I was feeling, but I clearly was acting out. So I spent my time on doing some volunteer work that I could control how much time. And when that came to be too much, I started doing volunteer work that I could do computer work for people at home. The whole process with the post-polio has been a series of downturns and then a plateau, which may last a year or more. And then more deterioration and more plateaus. And it's been 25 years since I stopped working that I've been dealing with the real deterioration. And so now I use a motorized wheelchair at home, again, to conserve energy. I'm trying to conserve the little bit of muscle use I still have in my right leg, which I still call my good leg, even though it's not so good anymore. About 2 years ago, I had to go back to a brace on my right leg, which I hadn't had in 60 years. When I go out, I use my scooter. I can walk across the room and back with my crutches without it being a strain. But if I had to walk, around the medical school, I couldn't have done it. Yeah.
But your breathing's okay?
Thankfully, my breathing was never affected.
Which is one of the problems that some individuals have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They didn't have the respirators like they do now, and they were in iron lungs using the negative pressure, positive pressure.
Yeah. And so, but before the deterioration in the last few years, you did an awful lot of traveling too, didn't you?
I'm still doing traveling.
Okay. So tell us all the places you've been.
Well, we have been on all 7 continents.
Antarctica?
2 years ago, we went to Antarctica. Almost.
You've been to the Arctic too? And you've been-
Well, we've been in Norway and
Norway.
Iceland. Greenland we found was a stumbling block. We couldn't do Greenland because you couldn't, well, it was a long story, but that's how we ended up in Antarctica because we couldn't do Greenland. We have become, we used to be, we have always traveled on our own because we need to accommodate my needs. My husband is a whiz on making travel arrangements over the internet and in finding places that are accessible. Got a number of friends who have traveled with us who are trying to convince him to plan their vacations. And so we have done Europe extensively. We've been to on African safaris, 3 different trips. I love that.
Tell them the story. I enjoyed hearing the story about Singapore and all the issues related to that.
We lived in Singapore for 2 years. My husband's job took us there. And it's a very inaccessible place. And the feeling I got was almost that was on purpose, that I was not supposed to go everywhere and be seen. The people, the local people were very uncomfortable with my disability. And I found this a lot in other parts of Asia. I went with some friends to Hong Kong for a few days. And I couldn't take the subway, which was the easiest way to get around. The taxi drivers would not pick me up. And someone, Chinese descent, explained to me that I had bad luck. And so they didn't want to make contact with my bad luck because it could affect them and their family. And so, not knowing that, not being sensitive to that, and needing a taxi, I would send a friend out, and I'd kind of stand off to the side and get her to call the taxi, and she would get in. And then when I showed up, they couldn't drive away, and I would get in, and they would take us wherever we needed to be. But on the other hand, Singapore was a great place to travel from. It was, our children were old enough, we were able to take them all over Asia and expose them and enjoy ourselves, just meeting people in different places, seeing the wonders of that part of the world. We just really enjoyed that part of it.
Any thoughts for the physicians and the healthcare people in the audience in terms of interaction between you and your physicians and you and healthcare individuals in terms of things that could help us provide care to other people in a better way?
Be Dr. Harrington. Be Paul Harrington. And I know doctors don't have the kind of time where they can spend an hour with a patient now, but it was so important to my life and also my family for him to be involved in not just my physical well-being, but also my emotional well-being, and making sure that I was set to be successful in life. I had a problem with my shoulder a few weeks ago. I'm now at the point where I'm having those mechanical problems that come with a certain age and using crutches for 62 years. And I went to an orthopedist who had no background in post-polio, knows the basics that you can't exercise, you can't do. And he said to me, I know how important your arms are to you, so I will treat this maybe a little more aggressively than I would another patient, because you use your arms to transfer, you use your arms to walk. And so he saw me as a whole person, not just my shoulder. And that was, so appreciated. it was just try to be where your patients are that day at that time, and it will mean a lot to them.
So you've obviously had a great deal of resilience in terms of your life. Any advice as to where did it come from? Where did that spring from?
I think I was born with a positive personality. I think I was raised that you don't focus on what's bad that's going on. There are people who have it a lot worse off than you do. And my mother would periodically, when things weren't going the way I wanted them to, periodically we'd have to go visit the children in the hospital and see really sick people, people who really are having a hard time. And so it's given me some perspective, or it did, as I was growing up. And I've had a wonderful life. I've been very, very lucky. I have a wonderful husband who was able to, at the age of 19, to see me as more than just my physical disability. I think that's just amazing. So I'm very, very fortunate.
Well, I know I speak for everybody. This has been a wonderful hour, and really a really remarkable person and a great life, as you say. That was great.
Thank you.